and welcome to Interfaith Connections. I am your host, Jackie Fuller. Today's episode, we're focusing on faith-based advocacy, and one issue that has been coming up in Virginia is solitary confinement. And we have two experts today who will speak on this matter, and you can learn more about what's going on in this space. And I have here John Horsch, who's been on our show before. He is the coordinator for social action linking together, or SALT, and Gay Gardner. She is representing the organization known as Interfaith Action for Human Rights. And we are so glad to have them on the program. Thank you for coming on, and welcome back.
Glad to be back.
It's
an honor.
To have you
Thank
here
you.
on the show.
Thank you very much.
So, Gay, since this is your first time, can you share with our audience some background information about yourself and your work?
Sure. I'm currently serving as the Secretary of Interfaith Action for Human Rights. We're a faith-based advocacy group based in Washington, D.C., and we work against torture in U.S. prisons, primarily solitary confinement in Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. So my work is primarily focused on Virginia. And we are a group of people who came to this work initially through our previous experience as anti-torture advocates, primarily through the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, or NERCAT. And we were formed, IAHR was formed as an independent nonprofit organization that grew out of NERCAT. We initially were working against torture of suspected terrorists in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And I started learning more about solitary confinement in that context because we learned that prolonged isolation was one of the key tools that was used to break psychologically the 9/11 detainees. And then NERCAT, the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, decided that if it was going to be serious about working on U.S.-sponsored torture, that it needed to also address torture in U.S. prisons. And so that's how they got involved in looking at solitary confinement in prisons throughout the U.S. And then when we formed as a regional offshoot of that organization, we focused on the Mid-Atlantic region.
Okay. John?
We're a grassroots legislative advocacy group, and basically we have a lot in common with Gay's group, and the thing that we have most in common is in the name of her organization is Interfaith Action, and ours is social action. And the key word there is action.
Yes.
And we believe our commitment is to advocacy, which is personal responsibility. Our faith, we give personal witness to our faith by being a voice for the voiceless, and there's no greater need for a voice than in solitary confinement. And we came to the issue through Gay. She came through some of our events, and we learned. But we also started with the issue when we learned that the Department of Corrections had women in shackles when they were in labor. Sometimes women are pregnant when they go to jail. And so we started meeting with the Department of Corrections to stop that. And basically that led us to another issue when we had success. One success, the best success is to have another issue and go on and what you've learned put to practice. So we're doing that with solitary confinement. And I think the main thing about our being a voice for the voiceless is we're reminding the legislators of their responsibility to the most vulnerable people in Virginia. And heavens knows they need help because they're not at the policy-making table when decisions are made about their lives. So that's...
Yeah, I was going to say John and SALT have been great partners with us. One of the things we've done is to form a coalition with other interested individuals and organizations like SALT. And Our coalition partners include SALT and Virginia Cure, which is an advocacy group formed by family members of inmates in Virginia prisons, and as well as the ACLU and the Virginia Council of Churches. And we're looking to expand our coalition, and we hope to add some more partners in the coming year.
Over the last few years, we've had quite a few successes, but we've realized sometimes success is necessary to enter into a coalition. So we're real glad to be working in this coalition because we're kind of Northern Virginia based, and the coalition is more broadly based, brings on support around the state that we can't accomplish without them. So, and again, sometimes entering in a coalition is a difference between a success and no success. So we're happy to be part of this coalition.
Okay, great. Now, for maybe the viewers who are not familiar with the whole concept of the confinement situation, what does that entail, and how does it, I guess, the challenges that inmates or the system itself is creating, like, because it's pretty much like it's like it's a box space almost,
right, exactly. Right? Yeah, when we talk about solitary confinement, what we mean is confining a person to a closet-sized cell for 22 to 24 hours a day. And there is a very solid consensus among mental health professionals and human rights advocates that constitutes torture. Right. And so that is what makes it a compelling issue to us as people of faith. And this consensus is so strong now that it has led to restrictions being embedded in international human rights standards. More specifically, the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners now say that no one should be in solitary confinement for more than 15 days at a time. So that is the standard that we are striving for being implemented across the country.
Okay.
Something that kind of brought us to the issue was that we worked with Patrick Hope, who was a delegate. And he got to visit Red Onion, and he found somebody who was in solitary confinement for 14 years.
Wow.
And that is cruel. Yeah. And it's, you got to realize that throwing away the key when people do something wrong and go to prison is that the key is going to be found. Mm-hmm. And that 90% of them are going to be released to the community. And the question is, do you want somebody going from solitary confinement for years being released to the community angry and very, mentally unbalanced or damaged by the experience? Or do you want somebody who has been through anger management and who has been through parenting? Yes. Most of them have children. Yes. And maybe prepared to get a job and go into the community. So which one do you want as your next door or your neighbor?
Right. Because it sounds like it's counterproductive if, you say when you go into the system, it's there to rehabilitate or reform you. But it sounds like this can have the opposite effect.
Well, it definitely does have the opposite effect. There's a large body of scientific evidence that shows that long-term isolation profoundly damages mental health. And it damages mental health in people who go into prison healthy, and it certainly exacerbates pre-existing mental health issues, which many prisoners have. And we find that too often people with mental health problems, instead of receiving treatment, are placed in solitary confinement because they have behavioral issues that are not properly diagnosed. Very often corrections officers aren't trained to distinguish between people who are acting out for no good reason, and people who can't really control their behavior because of underlying mental health issues. And so when you put people who have these kinds of problems in isolation for a long time, it's guaranteed to exacerbate the problems. And so you have symptoms that appear of people cutting themselves. Suicide rates are much higher among prisoners in solitary confinement than prisoners in the general population. People sort of lose touch with reality, because when you're alone all the time like that, you sort of lose any kind of reference point in the outside world. And so people will often develop hallucinations. So it's very harmful. And as John pointed out, what you really don't want to have happen is people being released into the community directly from solitary confinement. Now in Virginia, my understanding is that it's no longer the policy for people to routinely be released directly from solitary confinement, and they've set up reentry pods where people are given access to resources to help them find jobs and so forth when they get out. But we really have a lot of questions about the adequacy of the support that's provided to them in the reentry pods, and we've learned of cases where people don't go into the reentry pods as far in advance of their release date as they are supposed to on paper. And I've corresponded with many men at Red Onion Prison and Wallens Ridge Prison in Southwest Virginia, which is where most of the long-term segregation prisoners, as they call it, have been. And I know of one man, for instance, that I was in touch with, who was released from prison sometime last summer, but it was very clear from my correspondence with him that he had severe mental illness. He recognized that he did. He was not being treated other than through psychotropic drugs. And we don't know what's happened to him. I was very worried about him because it was clear that he was not prepared to function in society. And we, of course, have lost touch with him now and don't know his whereabouts. But it makes you wonder how many other cases like this are there. We just don't know.
We're really concerned about people who are mentally healthy. They deteriorate, especially if it's prolonged. And I think the thing we're looking at is the prolonged solitary confinement, and that it should be a last resort. What we keep hearing is that they file a grievance against a guard or something, and all of a sudden they find themselves in solitary confinement for minor infractions and this kind of thing, so it's being abused. But the other thing is that it's practical reasons. It's very ineffective, and it's very costly. I mean, it probably costs 2 or 3 times as much for the prisoner who is in solitary confinement. So there's a lot of practical reasons. And I guess Gay can tell you more, but Department of Corrections started a step-down program, which they can set goals, and if they meet the goal, they can have the time reduced. And basically, we're hearing that there's being put in and not told why, and they're told, if they're told how long they're going to be in, which they're supposed to under the step-down program, then sometimes when the time is up, they continue to stay in solitary confinement. So we're looking for ways to control for this, to have some accountability, some transparency that we feel is lacking right now. It's just, there are abuses in the system.
Yeah, if I can expand on that a little bit. There are a couple of different contexts in which solitary confinement is used in Virginia. And by the way, they give it all sorts of different labels. They don't like to call it solitary confinement. They call it segregation or special housing or restrictive housing or some other euphemism like that. But it's all, keeping people in a tiny cell for 22 to 24 hours a day. And sometimes it's used for comparatively shorter periods as punishment for a disciplinary infraction. And we find this happens quite a bit with nonviolent infractions, as John mentioned, mouthing off to a guard or having
a grievance, I think.
Filing a grievance, yes. It's used as retaliation, allegedly.
Yeah.
This is what we hear from them. And as John mentioned, they're not told how long they're going to be in isolation when that happens. We had a case that came to our attention recently of 6 men at Nottoway Correctional Center, which is a medium security facility. They had the practice of gathering periodically for Bible study. And once they were in a room doing Bible study together, as they told us. And there was a conversation going on in the same room among other inmates about new restrictions on mail that had been imposed and how they could grieve that or, protest those restrictions. There was a guard who thought the men who were doing Bible study were participating in that other conversation. The men in Bible study were taken out of the room, put in solitary confinement, and then the next day they were sent to Red Onion Prison, a maximum security prison. And they were in solitary there for 62 days. When we found out about it, we sent an email to the Department of Corrections, the Director of Corrections and several of his staff, raising concerns about this. We later learned that the next day they were released from solitary, but they're still in Red Onion Prison. We don't know why, and they were not told why this was happening to them. They were not told how long they would be in solitary. Every time they asked somebody, they were given a different answer. And this happens all too frequently. The decisions to put somebody in solitary are not documented. So all of these are concerns of ours because the indefinite nature of isolation compounds its stressfulness. And there's no meaningful opportunity to challenge a decision to put somebody in solitary confinement. The other part of the problem that John alluded to was prisoners who are put in long-term isolation because the decision is made that they are too dangerous to be in the general population. There again, there's a lot of secrecy associated with that kind of decision. And the step-down program that John referred to is a mechanism that Virginia implemented in 2012 to enable those men who are in long-term isolation to gradually transition back to the general prison population. And there are certainly success stories associated with that. There are many men who have gotten out of isolation that way. And the numbers the Department of Corrections cites of men who have transitioned that way are impressive. But we have found that there is a subset of those prisoners who are labeled the worst of the worst. They're given the designation IM, which stands for intensive management. And those prisoners are never allowed, generally never allowed, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions that we're aware of, they're never allowed to leave isolation, even if they successfully complete the step-down program. So we have a great concern about that because that, for all the reasons we've been discussing, that should never happen in our view.
I think the one thing, a couple things we're pushing for or working toward is, due process when they go in, so that they, like the Bible study, they could make their case to be able to document that they, that this is appropriate, because it mentally it breaks them when they go in, and so then if their time is up, as part of what we're working for is, they need to be told why they're being, and that there's due process, and then when the time is up, we're hearing, I think, as well, that they're not being told while it's being expended, or why it continues. They're not given an explanation,
and this, if I could just finish the problem with the IM prisoners, the so-called worst of the worst. They're rated periodically on different categories of behavior. So, and these categories include things like keeping their cell neat, maintaining proper hygiene, standing for count when the guards come through and call their name, and showing respect. And so if they get a certain number of negative ratings in any of those categories over a review period, they are held back within the step-down program, or maybe even put back to the beginning. And the big question behind that, I think, is why do you need to keep someone in permanent isolation because they've gotten bad marks in those kinds of categories? That it certainly doesn't reflect that they're a danger to the prison or to other inmates or to staff. So how do you justify keeping them in permanent isolation for reasons like that? And they are never shown these rating charts. So they're, again, they're kept in the dark.
Now, I want you guys to explain to our audience the event the both of you attended, or participated, coordinated, all the above. How did that go? Explaining to the
Well, I think it was
community.
outstanding. The audience was really supportive and receptive, and they got the message. And I think the education was good, and I think it's going to help us to move forward, because my sense is many of them do communicate with their legislators, and we're so frustrated at this point. We're looking at legislative requirements, putting on some more accountability, and through legislation that they have to be evaluated. The goal is to reduce the solitary confinement, but to eliminate it for the mentally ill, which means they have to have medical reviews before they can go in, and that they have to be evaluated mentally, because the Department of Corrections is not equipped for treatment, and so to put them in isolation, solitary, is not treatment, it's mentally cruel, or if they're mentally ill, they're just going to be more severely mentally ill. So, and calling it something else isn't going to solve the problem.
There are a lot of ways that people can get involved in helping with our advocacy. For one thing, you can just Google Interfaith Action for Human Rights, and you'll go to our website, and you can register and give us your contact information and indicate that you want to volunteer with us. And we'll be doing a lot of advocacy with legislators and public education events and that sort of thing. And we do also have a pen pal project that I started at my church, Little River United Church of Christ in Annandale. But if people want to participate in that, I can certainly help them get involved, where we match up a prisoner with a correspondent who writes to them once a month to just ease their isolation and loneliness. And it's a good way to get involved.
I think a number of states have been very successful in reducing and almost eliminating. I think 3 states have actually eliminated solitary confinement, and they've been pleasantly surprised when the people in solitary confinement go out into the prison population that they adapt and adjust, and that it's working out. So I think that we're looking at, some of these states have legislation that help to accomplish this, and we're looking at that as a possible key to our success. And we're meeting with a legislator on Monday about this. We have seen a bill from New Jersey that looks like it meets most of our concerns. And so we're hopeful maybe we can adapt that, or if it's needed, that's kind of a last resort. But that's one option that we're looking at.
Okay. Any final thoughts, last words before we wrap up for today's program?
Well, I think this is really, as a person of faith, I really found this a compelling issue, because I think all the major religions of the world call us to defend the dignity of every person, and to honor the notion that no one is disposable in our society. And these are people who have truly been forgotten, and they need our support.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's the thing that all faiths have in common, is this is a human dignity issue, and that the faith community needs to stand up for people who are vulnerable and who are the most in need, and most needing our voice. There's one thing about hearing and learning and studying about it, but there's the doing aspect too, and I think that's what we're about.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you both for coming on the program.
Oh,
this was really interesting.
Thank you
and
for having us.
I hope that more people and more traditions get involved. So thank you so much for all you do, and hopefully you will get some more folks to support
Thank
your
you.
efforts.
Very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And thank you, the audience of Interfaith Connections. If you want to learn more about our program, visit us online at www.interfaithconnections.squarespace.com, or you can follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/IFC TV show. Thank you so much for watching, and take care. Bye-bye.